So we're going to walk through an evangelistic preaching structure, and I know that this can be somewhat tedious, but it's important that we do look at outlining and structuring our outlines around the biblical passage or the textual passage that we're looking at. Notice that it is a text, it's biblical, it comes from biblical genre, it communicates a certain particular focus, and so this is the goal for this particular lecture. So I want to look at structure, I want to look at sermon structure considering the outline. Outlining normally has generally 3 Roman numeral pointing, could be more, but generally in preaching or the science of preaching, we work from a 3-point outline, and that roughly gives you about 30 minutes in your presentation. So Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3, or there are some contemporary ways of framing your outline of just doing number 1, number 2, and number 3. And Microsoft Word provides some different background on that. But what I want to do here is I want to look at sermon outlining and note that they're most likely in your sermon preparation going to have 3 ways in which your passage will emerge. And I'm meaning by this your outline. And so at the passage level, you should be working through your biblical passage, looking at observation. This is the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so your passage outline is going to be very heady. It's going to focus on historical. It's going to focus on words and phrases that the author might be using in that particular section of the book. And then what it's really communicating is what happened. What is the author's intent by this passage, this section in the biblical book that you're studying? And what it does, it anchors the preacher within the particular text that he is planning to present on any given Sunday or Bible study. So it's an anchor for the preacher to be in the passage, and you're studying, you're looking around, you're looking in, you're trying to study the phrases. And then once you move from the passage outline, it forms the basic skeleton of the message. You will then move to a truth outline. And so basically you're taking what you've established in the passage outline and you're now flipping it. Okay? You're moving from what happened in the past to it happens, and you're taking the passage to its current context, building the take-home truth. We would say that's a central theological truth, or that's a central propositional point that you're going to make for your presentation, let's say on Sunday. And often that central propositional point is you're repeating it, you're restating it in another way. So it's theological, it's universal statements, it's comments that the author is making that you're finding within that particular passage, and you're building it out. You're pulling it out of the passage in order to develop this build or construct this take-home truths or truth that you intend to give on your biblical message. And then from the truth outline, you're going to then change it up just a bit in a more creative way, honing in on how can I present the passage, the truth, the biblical truth, the central biblical truth, and how do I then make it and construct it into a sermon that's presentable. And that's what we would call the sermon outline, the happening, and what is God saying to us. And often this will take on applicational points such as go do. This is what the author is asking, or at least commanding us or giving us instruction about, or this is how God is framing the biblical truth, and this is our action point to move forward. Just know that each of the outlines is somewhat similar. It just takes on different forms, and you'll have a final form in which you'll present on Sunday. I would say this, that you need to think of your outline like a table of contents that you would find in a book. So go to the table of contents in any given book, and you will find that it's very short, it's to the point, you know exactly what you're going to cover based on what you see. And that is generally what should happen in your sermon outlining. You want it to be memorable. You want it to be short. Remember, people are jotting down notes. And so if you have long sentences as your points, people might miss it unless you have some type of fill in the blank and they're getting the totality of that sentence and they're just, they're just filling in the one word. That might work, but just remember that it should be short, succinct, to the point, and it covers the proximity of what that verse is saying, using creative means, of course, to do it. Now, Remus Richard, in his book, again, this is based on preparing expository sermons, and this book you're not using in this particular class, but you will in others. But he talks about building the expository sermon based on this bridge concept. And so on the left side of the screen, you are studying the biblical passage. And at that point, the preacher is analyzing the text. He is beginning to formulate an outline. So you're pulling together what we would call the exegetical outline, the structure around, or the skeleton around what this passage or narrative section, say, of the Old Testament, and how you're to build it and move it forward. And then from the exegetical outline, you begin to come down to this exegetical idea that you should be able to turn into a timeless truth, or another way of saying it, it's your homiletical idea on the right side of the bridge. And you basically are flipping and changing the word subtly in order that you can present this in a Sunday morning message or whatever you tend to preach to a live audience. Please note, normally an exegetical outline and an exegetical idea are normally not presented in your final presentation. It's part of your note-taking, your observation level, your study time. That doesn't mean you would never present it. You could, depending on the context of your message and the audience to which you're delivering. And so maybe you are delivering it amongst pastors, and so you need to be more exegetical than maybe the more homiletical or applicational, because they're wanting more head knowledge. But again, we could talk more about that on a later period and when you should or should not do that. Then you move up the bridge, and now you're seeing that there's 3 developmental questions that should help you build this bridge so that it's applicational. It's moving the listener through the particular passage that's being addressed. And you're also touching on the human emotion side of those who are listening to your message. And remember, the brain is at work, and therefore they're hearing what you're going to say. And so you have to raise up that emotion in such a way that they're saying, yes, I'm understanding where you're heading. So we move from flesh level and looking at the skeleton, the bones, the structure, and then we're thinking through the exegetical idea, which is essentially the homiletical idea. It's the heart of your biblical message. And again, you're moving toward your homiletical idea, which is number 7. You're bringing about clarity. You have an introduction to your message. You then also have a conclusion where you tie in all the statements, your outlining points. You might re-summarize them at the end. And then again, you may restate the big idea or the central homiletical idea or the central propositional point. And the last phase is doing all the manuscript, and you'll eventually preach it. Why do I say you should manuscript your sermon? Because what happens is we do rabbit trails. Unless we have a healthy, vibrant outline that exactly tells us where we're going and how we intend to arrive at our points, we can often get into distractions with our biblical preaching. So it's necessary for you to manuscript, or at least have a full working outline that's very detailed and has some narrative form to it to keep you on the right trajectory, and that's effective biblical preaching. Now, there are some types of sermon structure, and I'd like to provide on this slide a brief overview of what this would look like potentially for your sermon and as you move ahead. So types of sermon structure. Again, you have introduction, you have the body, which make up your points. Okay, make up your points, your number 1, number 2, number 3, could have a number 4 depending on the length and time. Again, I've seen individuals might have 5 points, but you're going to have to prove that and endeavor to help the people work through it. And again, we're often time bound, and that means that we have given a certain amount of time to preaching on Sunday, and that might only be about 30, maybe no more than 40. And again, I've seen preachers extend that a little bit, but you better have reasons why you're extending it for your people. But again, introduction might be a story leading into your biblical passage, your main idea, and you're helping the people. It might give some historical background as well. And of course, the worst thing you could do is not have a good conclusion to your message. Again, that could be summarizing the body of truths that you've given, the central propositional point. Could end with a story, a quote, something that ties, again, the structure and the components of your biblical message. Now, as you think about types of sermon structure, we can move from inductive to inductive models, and I want to show you that here on what it looks like. So in the deductive model, you automatically start off with your central propositional statement. I often do that in my message. I state up front what I'm going to cover. And I also provide a fillable blank within my bulletin for church. And so there will actually just be one blank that the people will fill in, and that will appear by PowerPoint or whatever media presentation that you might use in your church. So I state it up front. I tell the people exactly where I'm going in order to then wrap around the other 3 subject points, which is the body of the sermon. Again, that's deductive. And then I give my end conclusion. I might, again, repeat everything I've already stated and summarize it for them in a short little 5-minute summary. Again, I restate the central propositional statement. So it starts narrow and then it moves outward, okay? So I want you to note that as you move ahead in your preparation for your preaching. Now let's look at the inductive way, and both are not wrong, okay? So I think you're gonna have to figure out which one is most suitable for you and your particular audience you're working with. And so here we begin with more of a thematic way of introducing the concept of the passage to the group that I'm preaching and been invited to preach, or I'm the pastor of that church. So I start more thematically. But again, we have the same body of structure, such as 1, 2, and 3. And again, giving amount of time for each of these points. And then I give at the conclusion, the central propositional statement. It's the memorable statement that wraps up all of what I've already introduced about the theme, the 3 points, and then I conclude it. And by the way, I may say that central propositional statement several times in my conclusion so that people heard it, and they heard it again, and then I repeat it so they hear it again before they leave. But notice the difference between, as you look at it from, I start narrow in the deductive model and I start wide in the inductive approach. So let's think through more of a hybrid model, which is looking at both the inductive and deductive together. And so I state the theme up front, work through my individual points, but notice in the middle is where I'm giving my central big idea or central propositional statement. Haddon Robinson talks about the big idea, so you'll hear me repeat that often in the course. Just know that he's been a tremendous help in the field of biblical preaching. He's no longer among us. He's with our Lord and lived a life well-pleasing unto the Lord, but a champion for biblical preaching nonetheless. So again, you have the central propositional statement that you conclude after you've given point number 1. and then you move toward point number 2 and so on, and point number 3. And so nestle in between your transitions from point 1 to point 2 and so on, you're giving that central propositional statement, and which then leads you to your next point. And then you restate it again. So in a inductive deductive model, you're repeating, restating in multiple ways. But notice how it looks from this different. Looks like a bow tie would be another way of observing this model. So what are some advantages? It's clear, it's up front. For the deductive, people know exactly where you're heading. In an inductive way, you're then keeping them interested in the topic at hand. Again, not bad, but it would require you to have multiple illustrations and stories to captivate the audience. And then as you work through each of the points, you know that once you get to the inductive, deductive, or hybrid model, as I say, it is a variety of different ways. And it also helps the listener to catch maybe what they missed as you move from one point to the next, because you might repeat that phrase or that statement that you've already covered. Now, inductive deductive model can take on a little bit longer in terms of scope of time. So rather you move from 30 minutes, maybe you're bumping up against a 40-minute window. But again, it's clear, interesting, and variety. You see the advantages of using the different models. Now, I'd like to focus here on this slide is deciding the sermon structure that you intend to think through. Where is the main idea? So in any given passage, whether it's a story in the gospel, such as a parable, or now you're going back to the Old Testament and you're looking at a narrative account, such as Genesis 22, or maybe it's not Genesis 22, maybe it's 2 Kings chapter 5, where Elisha is meeting up with Naaman, the commander of the Aramean army. So the question in that story is, where is the main idea? How can you arrive at it and eventually become the central propositional point? That's where discovery takes place. That's where you start working on the skeleton formation of your sermon. It's where you're doing observation. You're asking the who, what, where, when, why, and how of a given passage. And you're deciding at that level that at that point, I'm seeing it repeated again, the statement's repeated, or maybe I'm working in Joshua 1, where God tells Joshua, be strong and very courageous. And he repeats that several times in Joshua 1. So the main idea is, be strong and very courageous. Should be the general scope in which you're going to repeat for your people in your biblical sermon. So again, inductive, it's at the end. Deductive starts at the beginning. Where's the application? And of course, in all your preaching, you should be seeking application. You should be seeking to apply the biblical truth that you're uncovering for your people. And the different ways to think through it in the simple, straightforward process, simple inductive model versus cyclical inductive, where cyclical is cycle driven. Okay, you're giving the application throughout. And so you might have point number 1, and then you state the central propositional statement, and then you might have some application underneath that to help the people reinforce what you said in point number 1. And then you just do the same thing you do in point 2 and 3, is you provide different cycles to that. Simple deductive model, again, you do it at the beginning. You might also conclude at the end, and cyclical deductive way as well. Now, when you think about the simple inductive model through Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, we know that the church is growing rapidly. We see that in chapter 6, verse 1. There was a food crisis. They didn't know what to do, so they assembled 7 men to solve the problem, and they designated leaders. These leaders were gifted. They had certain character qualities they had to be tested with. And because of all that, the church began to grow and deal with the growth problems that were within the particular church setting. So the subject is this: when church growth problems arise, how should we solve them? Okay. Well, number one, their church was growing. We see that in verse 1. They had a food problem. And then lastly, they designated leaders. I'm always going back to that central question that I'm asking about the biblical text. Now, the apostles solved the growth problem with lay leadership. This is how they solved it. And they solved it in a number of ways. They found 7 men who were full of the Spirit, gifted, quality leaders, and they were tested. Okay? So the church was growing, they had a food problem, and they designated those leaders, respectively, to work within the church crisis. And then it leads us to our second statement, that the solution to the problems of growing church is lay leaders. That becomes my main idea that I want to give to the people who are listening. And so I'm going to restate that in a number of different ways to help solidify for them the main central problem that they are facing. Well, that leads me to number 3, that the solution to our problem is this. This becomes what Don Sanukian describes as the application section for biblical preaching. And this should also form your style as well of working through your biblical passage. So here is the exegetical idea presented in statement number 1. We move from inductive to the main propositional point, moving all the way down each line, re-engaging with the exegetical idea, of course, and then working through the passage. Again, let's look at this from a cyclical level. We have the subject again. We have a growing problem in the church, structural problem. This church, like ours, was growing. Their church was growing rapidly. We're growing, but growing churches have problems. They had a food problem. We have these problems. And so I bring it to the applicational level, and notice how it's being separated out, as Don Sanukian suggests, in terms of outlining. And that leads to number 3. The solutions is, again, to have lay leaders. Notice that there's not much difference between the 2 different outlines. It's in its presentation. And so that's where the creativity comes in all our biblical preaching, is the style by which we present the biblical text. I have a different style, you have a different style, but again, there's still structure around that style. And that's what I'm honing in on for this class, is that there is structure behind your biblical presentation. And of course, they solved it, and the way we solve our problems are, and then again, that goes into my applicational points that I can provide for the people. Here's another way of looking at it, looking at the exegetical idea versus the main idea. Again, the focus on the main idea is restated multiple times in your biblical message. Don't overkill, but you do need to mention it several times in your biblical message. So if it's about 30 minutes, you're roughly going to repeat the central main idea about 5 to 6 times. Might restate it in a number of other ways that people can still write down what you said, and it's memorable, and people can remember it as they leave. Okay, going back to deciding sermon structure versus inductive and deductive, whether you might go through a cyclical process. I do like cycle preaching, especially working with a narrative section or story. If I'm working in the Old Testament, much of the Old Testament is story. So it has an intro, has rising action. It's going to then lead to a climax, falling action, and conclusion. I like cycle preaching because then I can look at each of the different movements within the biblical text, and it helps the reader capture the general idea of what's going on in that particular chapter.